The house sat behind tall iron gates, quiet and perfect from the outside. Fresh paint, trimmed gardens, shining windows. People passing by often slowed down to look, thinking it must be a happy place. They never knew how heavy the air inside felt. The owner of the house was known everywhere. He had built his wealth from nothing and turned it into an empire. His name appeared in business magazines, news articles, and charity events. People called him strong, fearless, successful. But inside his own home, he felt helpless. His son lived in the largest room on the second floor, a room filled with expensive toys, soft carpets, and shelves of books no one touched anymore. The boy was 8 years old, but his eyes carried a tiredness that did not belong to a child. He barely spoke. Some days, he did not speak at all. It had not always been this way. Years earlier, the boy had been loud, curious, and full of questions. He loved drawing animals and building small cities from blocks. He followed his father around the house, asking how things worked and why people behaved the way they did. The father used to smile at those questions, proud and amused. Then one night changed everything. No one liked to talk about it. The parents avoided the details, and the staff only whispered when they thought no one was listening. After that night, the boy stopped being himself. He stopped sleeping well. Loud sounds made him panic. Sudden movements made him hide under tables or press his hands tightly over his ears. Doctors were called right away. The best doctors money could buy came from different cities, even different countries. They ran tests, asked questions, filled files with notes. Some said it was shock. Some said it was trauma. Others used long words that sounded hopeful at first, then empty later. Therapists followed. They sat across from the boy with soft voices and gentle smiles. They brought games, puzzles, and pictures. They waited patiently, sometimes for hours. Most sessions ended in silence. The boy stared at the floor or the wall, as if the world in front of him did not exist. Teachers tried next. Private tutors came with books and tablets, promising special methods and new techniques. They spoke about progress and plans. After a few days, each one quietly admitted the same thing. They could not reach him. Time passed, and hope slowly wore thin. The father began coming home later each night. Work felt easier than facing the quiet sadness waiting for him upstairs. The mother stayed close to her son, but felt invisible to him. She sang songs he once loved, told stories she used to read at bedtime. The boy listened without reacting, his face calm but distant. The house was always full of people, yet it felt lonely. Staff members moved carefully, lowering their voices near the boy's room. They followed strict rules. Do not touch his things. Do not speak suddenly. Do not look at him for too long. Everyone was afraid of making things worse. Some servants had been there for years. They had watched the boy grow. Now they watched him fade into silence. Many tried small gestures. A smile, a gentle greeting, a sweet treat left on the table. Nothing worked. After a while, people stopped trying. They did their jobs, avoided the second floor, and accepted that this was how things were now. Even the parents began preparing themselves for a future that looked very different from the one they once imagined. One afternoon, the father stood outside his son's room. Listening, there was no sound inside. He rested his hand on the door, but did not open it. He felt a deep ache in his chest, a pain no business loss had ever caused. He would have traded every success, every award, every amount of money, just to hear his son laugh again. Downstairs, the house manager reviewed a list. Another maid had quit. It was not unusual anymore. Many could not handle the heavy mood of the house. Others felt uncomfortable working where sadness seemed to live in every corner. The manager sighed and picked up the phone to call the agency again. Later that evening, the parents sat together at dinner, barely touching their food. "We have tried everything," the mother said quietly. Her voice sounded tired, like someone who had cried too much and slept too little. The father nodded. "Maybe some things cannot be fixed?" Saying it out loud felt like defeat. Upstairs, the boy sat on the floor near his window. Outside, the city lights glowed softly. He watched them without blinking. In his small hands, He held a broken toy, one he used to love. He turned it over and over, lost in thoughts no one could hear. That night, the parents went to bed with the same heavy silence. They did not know that soon someone new would walk through their front gate. Not a doctor, not a therapist, not an expert with long words and expensive promises, just someone no one expected to matter at all. And for the first time in a long while, something inside that quiet house was about to change. The next morning, a new figure entered the house. She was a young woman, quiet and careful, carrying only a small bag. She wore simple clothes, nothing flashy, but her eyes held a calm determination. She had grown up in a small town where money was scarce, and kindness was a necessity, not a choice. She knew how to notice things that others overlooked. The house manager met her at the door and gave her instructions in a low voice. "The boy. He has had many helpers. No one has succeeded. Do not startle him. Do not speak to him unnecessarily. Follow the rules." She nodded politely, but her eyes did not betray fear. She had been told rules like this before in other homes and other jobs, but she believed that rules were only part of a solution. Patience, understanding, small acts of care mattered most. The parents watched from a distance as she walked through the halls. They had almost given up hope that anyone could connect with their son. This new maid was just another name on a list, another hopeful arrival, and yet there was something about the way she moved and observed that made them pause. Perhaps it was the calmness in her steps, the attention she paid to the details of the house, and the quiet care in her gestures. The boy did not notice her at first. He sat in his usual spot near the window, staring outside. He had become used to strangers entering and leaving without acknowledgement, and he had learned that ignoring them was easier than interacting. But she did not rush toward him. She did not demand a smile or a word. Instead, she began her work quietly, cleaning, organizing, and moving around the room with soft, careful motions. Days passed, and she observed. She noticed the small signs that others had missed. The way he flinched at sudden noises, the way he watched shadows move across the room, the way he held certain toys close but ignored the ones others offered. She learned which corners of the room made him uncomfortable and which spots he returned to again and again. She saw the patterns, the routines, the hidden fears. Unlike others, she did not try to force interaction. She left small signs of her presence, like leaving a neatly folded blanket where he liked to sit, or arranging his toys in ways he had once preferred. She spoke softly to herself while working, her voice barely above a whisper, not expecting him to answer. Just filling the room with gentle human sounds, the parents watched with a mixture of hope and skepticism. They had seen many attempts fail, and each failure left a heavier mark on their hearts. But this maid seemed different. She did not show fear when the boy ignored her. She did not show frustration when progress seemed impossible. Instead, she moved with quiet confidence, like someone who understood that healing could not be rushed. Other staff members whispered about her. Some admired her patience. Some doubted her chances. But she paid little attention to gossip. She focused only on observing, learning, and waiting for the right moment. She began to notice tiny interactions that mattered. A glance the boy gave to a toy, a slight change in breathing when she entered the room, a hand that relaxed briefly before curling back in. Each small signal became a clue. She started leaving small gifts, things she had made with her own hands, folded paper animals, small drawings, tiny trinkets. Nothing expensive, nothing flashy, but carefully chosen to match his interests and memories. One afternoon, she placed a small hand-painted card on the table near his favorite chair. She stepped back and watched from a distance. The boy's eyes moved toward it. He paused, hesitated, and then slowly picked it up. For the first time in weeks, his lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but a moment of recognition, of curiosity. She did not rush forward or speak. She simply nodded to herself and continued her work. The parents began to notice small changes. Not words, not laughter yet, but small signs of engagement. The boy was no longer completely withdrawn. He watched her as she moved through the room. He began to touch the toys she had arranged. He even glanced briefly at her face before looking away. These were tiny victories, but to the parents, they were monumental. Days turned into weeks. She continued her gentle presence, observing, leaving small tokens, speaking softly to herself or to the surroundings. She never forced conversation, never demanded interaction, and never showed impatience. Slowly, the boy began to respond in his own way. A look here, a movement there, a hand reaching for a small gift. He began to recognize that she was safe, that she was not like the others who had come and gone. The staff began to notice the difference as well. The boy flinched less, moved more freely, and even allowed her to enter spaces that had been off limits before. He did not speak much, but he was present. He was alive in a way he had not been for a long time. The maid never sought recognition. She did not ask for praise or thanks. Her satisfaction came from small victories, from understanding the boy's needs and responding with care. She had no plan to conquer the silence or fix the trauma. She simply offered her presence, her patience, and her understanding. The house felt lighter, though still quiet. The parents felt a cautious hope. They began to allow themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, this time things could be different. The boy's world was small, cautious, and slow to change, but change was happening. And it was because someone had taken the time to see him as a child. Not as a problem. In the evenings, she would sit quietly in a corner of the room, her hands busy with small crafts, her eyes occasionally glancing at the boy. He began to notice her more. He did not speak, but he watched. The parents watched too, feeling emotions they had thought were lost forever. The fear of failure still lingered, but so did the faint, fragile hope. No one knew how far this connection could go. No one could predict the future. But one thing was clear. The boy was no longer completely unreachable. Someone new had entered his life, not with grand promises or expensive tools, but with patience, observation, and care. And for the first time in a long time, the possibility of healing felt real, tangible, and close enough to touch. And so, the house continued its quiet rhythm, but with one small difference. The presence of someone who believed that understanding a child required more than knowledge, it required heart, attention, and the willingness to try one last thing that no one else had thought of before. Weeks passed in the quiet house, and the maid's gentle presence began to weave itself into the boy's life. She had not rushed him or demanded words. She had simply observed, left small, thoughtful items, and spoken softly when needed. She noticed tiny details that others had ignored, the way he hesitated before stepping into a room, the way he clutched the edges of his blanket when nervous, the faint smile that came and went in moments she knew would be forgotten by anyone else. Her methods were simple, but their effect was subtle and profound. She began leaving small tokens each morning near his favorite spots: a paper crane, a tiny flower, a sketch of an animal he had once liked. These items were not expensive, but they were deliberate. Each carried a piece of care, a signal that someone was watching, understanding, and quietly supporting him. It was something the doctors could not prescribe, something the teachers had ignored, and something the parents had overlooked in their worry and sorrow. At first he barely noticed. The toys and tokens sat untouched. But gradually his curiosity began to awaken. One afternoon he picked up a small paper crane and turned it over in his fingers. Its folds were imperfect, but to him it carried meaning. It was the first time in months that he handled something outside of his immediate need or comfort. He did not speak, but his eyes lingered on the object. And in that moment the maid knew she had found a way into his world. She did not celebrate or call attention to it. She quietly placed another token the next day, something slightly different, hoping to maintain his interest without overwhelming him. The boy began to anticipate these small surprises. He would look for them in the morning, searching for the thoughtful gestures that now became the first signs of engagement with the outside world. Slowly, she tried speaking in small ways, not demanding conversation or forcing interaction, but soft, gentle words meant to comfort. She might comment on the weather outside the window or mention the sound of the wind through the trees. She spoke about things he could see or touch, things that were safe and predictable. Her voice was a steady presence in the room, something he could hear without fear. One day she shared a quiet story from her own childhood. It was simple, honest, and relatable. She did not ask him to respond, but she spoke as though he were listening, knowing that he might be. He did not say a word, but he leaned a little closer, turning his body just enough to show that her words had reached him. It was the first real connection they had shared, visible yet undeniable. The parents noticed the change with both hope and disbelief. Their son, who had been silent and withdrawn for so long, was showing signs of awareness, curiosity, and even engagement. They watched from afar, careful not to disturb the delicate process that had begun. They could see the small gestures, the boy handling the paper cranes, glancing at the maid when she spoke, adjusting his posture as if expecting a response. Each tiny act was a victory, and yet it was also fragile. Requiring careful nurturing, the staff also began to notice the difference. He flinched less at sudden movements. He allowed them to enter spaces he had previously avoided. And he even began to move more freely around the room. He was not yet talking, not yet laughing, but he was alive in ways he had not been before. The maid's presence had created a small, safe space for him, a world in which he could begin to trust without pressure or expectation. The maid never sought praise for her efforts. Her satisfaction came from seeing the small, almost imperceptible signs of progress. Each tiny gesture of acknowledgement from the boy was a reward in itself. She did not try to rush him, did not force conversation, and did not demand interaction. She understood that trust, patience, and quiet care mattered far more than any formal method or structured therapy. As the days went on, she began to incorporate more of his past interests into the environment. She found old drawings, small building blocks, and soft toys that he had once cherished. She placed them carefully in ways that invited exploration but did not overwhelm. She allowed him to rediscover these objects on his own terms, creating opportunities for him to connect with the world slowly and safely at times. She would simply sit in the corner, quietly observing and listening. She never hovered, never intruded, but her presence was constant and reliable. The boy began to notice this, responding in small ways, a glance, a slight nod, a hand reaching for an object she had placed. These gestures, though minor, represented a breakthrough. They were proof that her approach in old patient human was reaching him where others had failed. The parents began to see the truth of what she was doing. They realized that expertise and money had not solved the problem, but the maid's simple, patient attention was making a difference. They began to allow themselves to hope again, though carefully, cautiously, aware of the fragility of the progress. They watched as their son interacted with her in ways that were small but meaningful, and they began to feel a sense of relief they had not known in years. Evenings became quieter, but more alive. The boy would sit by the window with a small toy or a paper crane. She would be nearby, quietly crafting another token or arranging the room. The air in the house felt less heavy, lighter yet still calm. The boy had begun to emerge from his isolation. Not in words, not in grand gestures, but in small, human interactions that were real and lasting. No one could say how far this connection would go. The path ahead was still uncertain, and progress was slow. But one fact had become undeniable. The maid had reached him where no one else had. She had found a way into his world, not through force, money, or authority, but through patience, empathy, and small, deliberate acts of care. The house, once filled with silence and fear, began to feel different. The presence of someone who truly saw the boy, respected his pace and his fears, had created a foundation for trust and healing. And for the first time in a long time, the possibility of genuine connection and recovery seemed not only possible, but real. The maid had tried one last thing, something no one else had thought of, and it was beginning to make a difference that could change everything. The boy's world was slowly beginning to expand, though in ways that were almost invisible to outsiders. Every day, the maid continued her gentle presence, leaving small tokens, speaking softly, and moving with quiet care around him. She did not demand words or action. She simply existed in the same space, allowing him to decide how much of her presence he wanted to accept. One afternoon, she noticed him sitting in the corner, clutching a soft toy he had once loved. He seemed lost in thought, staring at the floor without moving. She quietly sat on the edge of the room, a small distance away, and started folding a paper crane. She spoke softly, barely above a whisper, telling a story about a bird that could fly anywhere it wanted, carrying messages of hope and courage. She did not look at him, did not force eye contact. She just spoke. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the boy lifted his head. His eyes, which had often seemed distant and unreachable, found hers for a fraction of a second. Then he looked away. But it was enough. Enough to show that her words were reaching him. Enough to make her heart beat with cautious hope. Over the next few days, this became a small ritual. She would tell stories about birds, trees, clouds, or simple things from her own childhood. He did not answer, at least not at first, but he began to listen, leaning slightly closer each time, touching the paper cranes she left, or holding a small toy in his hands as he absorbed her words. The change was subtle, but undeniable. The parents could hardly believe it. The boy, who had been silent and withdrawn for so long, was responding to something so simple and human. They watched quietly from the doorway, feeling a mix of relief, amazement, and guilt for doubting the power of small gestures and patient care. One day something remarkable happened. The boy, who had not spoken in months, softly muttered a single word as he reached for a paper crane. It was not a full sentence, not a conversation, but it was a breakthrough. The maid paused, heart racing, not wanting to frighten him with sudden movement or excitement. The word was repeated once, softly, then again, and she smiled quietly to herself. She did not rush forward. She did not make a big deal of it. She simply acknowledged it with her presence, allowing him to feel safe in expressing himself. This small act marked the beginning of a new phase. The boy began to interact more with his surroundings. He moved more freely around the room, touched objects he had ignored, and occasionally looked at the maid for reassurance. The trust that had once been missing was slowly being rebuilt, brick by brick, through patience, understanding, and unwavering care. The maid also noticed that his reactions were not just limited to her. He began to tolerate the presence of other staff members in the room, though cautiously. He still flinched at sudden movements, but the severity of his fear had lessened. His world, once confined and fearful, was slowly opening up to the possibilities of trust and connection. At times, she would sit quietly in the corner, working on small crafts while he explored the room, picking up toys or examining the paper cranes. They shared the same space, sometimes for hours, without a word. And yet, this silent companionship was full of meaning. He was learning that he could exist in the presence of someone without fear, and she was learning the subtle cues that indicated his comfort, interest, or distress. The parents continued to watch with careful hope. They saw their son beginning to smile at small things, touching objects with curiosity, and even humming softly while he played alone. These moments, though brief and fleeting, were evidence that he was returning to himself. The maid's approach, simple yet profound, had succeeded where money, expertise, and authority had failed. One evening, the boy picked up a small toy that had been part of his favorite game years ago. He turned it over in his hands, examining it carefully. Then, almost without thinking, he spoke a short phrase, asking the maid a question about it. Her heart leaped. She answered gently, encouraging him without overwhelming him. The boy listened, nodded, and even smiled briefly. It was the first real conversation in months, and it felt like a miracle. The parents could not contain their emotions. They embraced the maid quietly, thanking her in hushed voices, aware that the boy might retreat if they made too much noise. But the maid only smiled softly, shaking her head. She did not want thanks or recognition. She was content knowing that her patient care had helped the boy find his voice again. Days turned into weeks, and the boy's confidence grew. He began to initiate small interactions, asking questions about the paper cranes, the stories, or the toys. He no longer flinched at every movement, and he began to explore his environment with curiosity rather than fear. The house, once heavy with silence and sorrow, now carried a sense of quiet hope and cautious joy. The maid's efforts had created more than just communication. They had built trust, safety, and the foundation for emotional healing. The boy was learning that he could express himself, that his presence mattered, and that the world outside his isolation was not entirely frightening. The parents, grateful and humbled, began to see the truth of something they had overlooked. Real healing could not be bought or forced. It came from understanding, patience, and genuine care. The boy's breakthrough continued to grow. He spoke more, interacted more, and even began to smile naturally at small joys. He learned to ask questions, express preferences, and show affection in his own way. The house, once a place of fear and silence, became a home filled with hope, trust, and connection. And through it all, the maid remained quietly at his side, guiding without forcing, caring without demanding, and helping him rediscover the world one small step at a time. Her presence had transformed the boy's life, proving that patience, empathy, human connection could succeed where even the most advanced methods had failed. The boy had found his voice again, not through authority, expertise, or money, but through the gentle, persistent, and heartfelt care of someone who truly saw him. The boy's recovery continued, quietly but steadily. Each day brought small victories that gradually grew into something more tangible. He began to move freely around the house, exploring areas he had once avoided. The sound of voices no longer frightened him as much. He still had moments of fear and hesitation, but they were fewer, and each time he handled them with a bit more confidence. The maid remained a constant presence, always observing, always patient. She never pushed him beyond what he was ready for. She allowed him to take the lead, to explore his feelings, to express himself in his own time. Through her patience and care, he learned that the world could be safe, that he could be trusted, and that others could be trusted as well. One afternoon, the boy asked to help her with one of the small crafts she was making. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the paper and carefully folded it, but she encouraged him gently, letting him take his time. For the first time, he was participating, creating alongside someone rather than merely observing from a distance. The sense of accomplishment and pride in his small creation was visible in his eyes, and for the first time in years, he smiled without hesitation. The parents watched these moments with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. They had feared their son might never speak again, might never play again, might never experience joy again. Yet here he was, slowly returning to himself. They realized how much they had underestimated the power of simple human connection. Money, prestige, and authority could not heal a frightened heart. But care, patience, and empathy could. The maid also began to introduce small challenges that encouraged him to trust himself. She would leave small puzzles or activities for him to solve alone, and when he struggled, she would offer subtle guidance without taking over. Each time he completed a task, no matter how small, she celebrated his effort, reinforcing his confidence. He began to feel capable again, no longer defined solely by fear or silence. The boy's interactions with the rest of the household staff also improved. He began to tolerate their presence without panic, and gradually he even engaged with them in small ways. A nod, a smile, a brief conversation, all signs of trust that had once seemed impossible. The house, which had been heavy with tension and silence, began to feel lighter, filled with small pockets of laughter, quiet conversations, and shared moments. One day, the parents invited him to a small garden outside the house. They had avoided such outings for years, fearing sudden panic or distress. But the boy, now more confident and curious, agreed to go. He walked slowly, holding his mother's hand at first, but soon let go, exploring the garden on his own. He touched the flowers, watched the birds, and listened to the wind through the trees. The joy on his face was genuine, unforced, and it filled the parents' hearts with hope and relief. The maid followed at a discreet distance, ensuring his safety while allowing him independence. She knew that healing required both support and freedom. She did not seek recognition or praise, but the parents could not help but admire her dedication. Her actions had transformed their son's life, teaching them the value of patience, observation, and quiet, unwavering care. In the weeks that followed, the boy's confidence continued to grow. He spoke more frequently, laughed spontaneously, and even initiated small games with the maid and occasionally with the parents. He was no longer defined by his fear or silence. He had rediscovered his curiosity, his joy, and his ability to connect with others. The maid's influence extended beyond simple recovery. She had taught the boy and the parents the importance of seeing the person behind the fear, of respecting boundaries, while gently encouraging growth. She had shown that love and care were not about grand gestures or expensive solutions, but about presence, empathy, and understanding. The parents gradually realized that their son's healing was a shared achievement, one that required humility, patience, and genuine care. They learned to value the small, quiet victories as much as the big milestones. They watched their son thrive, not because of wealth or authority, but because someone had believed in him when everyone else had struggled to reach him. The boy's life began to resemble a normal childhood once again. He played with toys, read books, and explored his surroundings with curiosity and confidence. He laughed freely and expressed himself without fear. His bond with the maid deepened, built on trust, care, and mutual respect. She remained a guiding presence, allowing him to grow at his own pace, always ready to provide support when needed. The house, once filled with silence and tension, became a place of life and warmth. The parents and staff learned to interact with the boy differently, respecting his needs and celebrating his progress. The family began to heal together, experiencing the joy and connection they had feared lost forever. The maid never sought recognition or reward. She continued her work quietly, satisfied that her patient care had helped the boy rediscover himself. She had achieved something that no amount of money, expertise, or authority could have accomplished. She had reached a frightened child with empathy, patience, and simple human kindness. In the end, the boy's story became one of hope and resilience. He had been silent, withdrawn, and fearful, yet he had found his voice again. He had learned to trust, to play, to laugh, and to connect. The maid's quiet, patient efforts had transformed his life and taught everyone around him a valuable lesson. True healing comes from understanding, empathy, and unwavering human care. And through it all, the boy grew stronger, more confident, and more alive, surrounded by the love and guidance that he had needed all along. Months had passed since. The boy had begun to reconnect with the world around him. His confidence and curiosity had grown steadily. He had started to explore new parts of the house and garden with more freedom than ever before. But healing, as the maid knew, was not a straight path. There were still moments of doubt, fear, and hesitation. Some days were harder than others, and some nights left him restless, despite all the progress he had made. The maid continued her patient guidance, always there, but never overwhelming. She understood that true recovery meant giving him space to make his own choices, while gently encouraging him to step beyond his comfort zone. It was a delicate balance, and she handled it with care. She left small notes with simple words of encouragement near his favorite spots, placed tiny surprises to spark curiosity, and spoke softly about things he could relate to. One morning, she noticed the boy lingering at the top of the staircase, staring down at the hall below. He hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The maid approached slowly, keeping her distance so he wouldn't feel pressured. She spoke in a gentle, low voice, telling him a story about a boy who had once been afraid to step down a staircase, but found courage one small step at a time. She did not ask him to do anything, only shared the story. For the first time in weeks, he moved forward, taking a single step down, then another. He did not speak, but the movement was significant. The maid smiled quietly, her heart full of hope and patience. The boy's parents observed the scene from a distance. They had learned to respect the process and understood that pushing him could undo the progress he had made. Seeing him take small steps on his own gave them a sense of relief and pride. They realized that healing was not about speed or achievement, but about patience, trust, and understanding. Over the next few weeks, the boy began exploring more boldly. He visited parts of the garden he had avoided, touched flowers and plants, and even tried to follow small trails through the trees. The maid encouraged him, not with instructions, but by walking nearby and commenting on small observations, the way the sun lit a leaf, the sound of birdsong, or the feel of the wind on his face. These moments, though simple, were profound, helping him engage with the world without fear. He also began to interact more with the household staff. The boy, once silent and withdrawn, now nodded, smiled, or offered brief words of thanks. He was still cautious, but his gestures reflected growing trust and recognition of the people around him. The staff, who had once feared his reactions, now felt a sense of pride and relief. They saw a child slowly reclaiming his life and spirit. One evening, the maid suggested a small project. She brought out art supplies and set up a little space where the boy could draw or paint freely. At first, he hesitated, unsure of what to do. She sat nearby, quietly working on her own paper, showing that there was no pressure to perform. Slowly, he began to experiment with colors, shapes, and designs. Each stroke of his brush or pencil was an expression of creativity and freedom, a sign of his emotional growth. He spoke occasionally, asking questions about colors or sharing small thoughts about his drawings. The maid encouraged him with quiet words and gentle smiles. Reinforcing his confidence without forcing interaction, the parents, seeing him engaged in the creative process, felt a renewed sense of hope. They understood that these small, meaningful moments were helping their son not only communicate, but also rediscover joy and self-expression. It was a profound realization. True growth and healing could not be measured by words alone, but by actions, curiosity, and engagement. In addition to creative activities, the maid introduced small challenges that encouraged independence. She would leave items for him to find, simple puzzles to solve, or small tasks to complete in the garden. Each success, no matter how minor, boosted his confidence and reinforced the idea that he could face challenges and overcome them. He learned to trust his own abilities. Gaining a sense of accomplishment that had been missing for so long, the boy's relationship with his parents also evolved. The once distant child now began to show affection, offering hugs, holding hands, or speaking short sentences. The parents, mindful not to overwhelm him, responded with warmth and encouragement. These moments, built on trust and understanding, were the culmination of months of patient care and gentle guidance. One day, the boy discovered a small bird's nest in the garden. He watched the tiny birds with fascination, carefully observing their movements and listening to their chirps. The maid joined him, speaking softly about the birds, their habits, and the importance of patience in watching them grow. The boy listened, asked questions, and even tried to gently touch the nest without disturbing it. This moment reflected his growth, curiosity, empathy, and careful attention to the world around him. The maid continued to provide support through these experiences, always emphasizing observation, patience, and respect. She never forced him to engage, but offered opportunities for learning and discovery. The boy responded to this approach, gradually becoming more confident and willing to explore both his environment and his own feelings. The household, staff, and parents saw the transformation clearly. The boy had gone from a silent, withdrawn child to someone capable of curiosity, creativity, and connection. His growth was steady, sometimes slow, but undeniably real. The maid had facilitated this change not through authority, money, or professional expertise, but through empathy, patience, and a consistent, caring presence. In the evenings, the boy and the maid would sit together quietly, sometimes speaking, sometimes simply sharing the space. They had developed a bond built on trust and mutual respect. The boy had learned that he could rely on someone outside his family, and the maid had witnessed firsthand the power of quiet, patient care in transforming a life. The boy's confidence continued to grow in daily life. He took small walks around the property, explored new areas, and even began to play simple games with other children when they visited. These interactions, once unimaginable, demonstrated his emotional resilience and the success of the gradual, human-centered approach the maid had employed. The parents, reflecting on the journey, understood that their son's healing was a shared effort, requiring humility, patience, and the willingness to see him as a person rather than a problem. They were grateful for the maid's unwavering dedication, which had made the impossible possible. Ultimately, the boy's life had been transformed by the care and attention of someone who truly believed in him. He had regained his voice, curiosity, and confidence. He had learned to trust, explore, and connect with the world around him. The maid's approach, centered on empathy, patience, and understanding, had proven more powerful than any therapy authority or wealth. Through continued guidance and consistent support, the boy thrived, becoming a child who embraced life, joy, and learning. The house, once filled with silence and fear, became a home of warmth, curiosity, and connection. And the boy, once withdrawn and lost, had found his way back into the world, stronger, happier, and fully alive, thanks to the patient care and unwavering belief of someone who never gave up on him.